Hi, friends and family,
Welcome to Hope After Addiction
with your host, Katie Comer.
and Chelsea McLeod.
Hi, welcome, friends. We are so happy that you have joined us today. We hope that y'all are doing well. We are just so thankful. I just want to take this time just to say how thankful we are that you listen to us every week. We get some really good feedback from some friends that listen to us. And so I'm just so thankful for you listening. Make sure you're sharing us with other people who might be going through some stuff. But anyway, I just wanted to take that time to say thanks.
Yeah,
for
I love
listening.
that. And it's super important because we do get the sweetest encouragement, and just because we have no idea who listens or
Yeah.
watches. You know, some comment, but half the time on that, we don't know
Yeah.
who they are,
Yeah.
you know, with like a YouTube name. So
Yeah.
y'all are very special to us and keep us going.
Yes.
So.
So we're so thankful. Are you doing good
Yeah, doing well.
today?
Growing a big baby. How are you?
Yeah. Just like an oven.
I know.
Over here, just
like an
growing a
oven.
baby.
Mm-hmm.
No, I'm doing good.
Yeah.
Nothing new here. So
Yeah.
just excited to be here this morning.
I know. Me too.
Today we're going to be talking a little bit about how if you change the narrative, how it can change the outcome of your story. And so it'll be interesting to see the kind of perspective that both of us took on that.
Yeah.
Chelsea came up with the idea. And so sometimes when one of us comes up with the idea, we have like a different version of what we're talking about. So it'd be interesting to see, because we don't talk about what we're going to talk about on the podcast before we talk about it.
No.
It's always kind of new to us because we like the fresh and the authenticity of talking about it. So, so if you change the narrative, you can change the outcome. That is where we're going to talk about today.
Yep. Us this. How many of you are so grateful that God did not answer specific narratives in your life that you wanted years ago?
Yeah.
Like if you think back to the prayers that you prayed, I mean, even in middle school and high school.
Yeah, I know.
I am so glad that my narrative was not God's narrative.
Yeah. He knows better.
He knows way better.
Where would we be?
Where would we be?
If our narrative came true.
I actually was sitting here preparing for this and thought back to a lot of the prayers that I had prayed, whether it went to like boys or different things. And I'm like, God, thank you so much. But I think, and I don't even remember where I heard, like Katie and I both, we listen to songs or sermons or podcasts, whatever, and we get an idea for this podcast, or you guys, sometimes you guys will send them. But this one is, when you think about narrative, I think a lot about perspective. And so your narrative changes everything. Your perspective of your situation changes everything in the outcome. And, you know, you can either be a bitter Betty at 95 because you have lived in a narrative that is poor, pitiful me or victim, or you can live in victory as your narrative changes to follow with Jesus in this and let him do what only he wants to do, because he knows we don't. He sees what we don't.
Yeah.
So Isaiah 55:8 says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, and my ways are not your ways, declares the Lord." You know, and I'm so grateful that, one, we can't see it. One, we can't know it because we couldn't handle it.
Yeah. I think that to kind of piggyback off of that thought, is kind of having a renewed mindset, and having, replacing your negative thoughts.
Yes.
Because a lot of times when we go through something, I'm very guilty of it all the time. I will say.
Yeah.
Like negative thoughts of like, what's the worst case scenario
Oh, yeah.
that can happen here?
Yeah.
So whatever you're going through, I'm sure we've all done it. What is you just think of all the negative thoughts. So when we're trying to change the narrative, how can this change the outcome of it? If you replace those negative thoughts with positive thoughts and align them with God, and his will and his purpose, how that shift in your mindset, the renewed mindset, can be so beneficial for your story.
Yeah, and it goes back to taking every thought captive.
Yeah.
Because let's think about this. We work with so many different people. Like, you may have been in addiction with your husband for 16 years. You may have been walking through this addiction for just a couple years. You know, you may be walking a very short time. But in that time, you lose sight of yourself. What you see and tell yourself is a lot of negative. He's using again. He's gone again. He's hiding again. He's lying again. So we are constantly filled with negative. So a lot of times in the midst of walking in that season of addiction or whatever you're in, if it's medical diagnosis, whatever it may be, you almost have to, like Katie said, regain the power of the mind and the power of this
Super
perspective.
powerful.
Yeah. And take every thought captive and trace it back to what Jesus says over what the enemy wants to whisper and lie to you. Because the enemy wants your narrative to stay terrible and negative with no hope and no restoration and no redemption. That's what he wants.
Yeah.
So by you changing that narrative, you
taking that
are
captive.
claiming victory.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Take your thoughts captive. I like that.
Mm-hmm.
Is another way. Another thing is by changing the narrative, you can view, and it's kind of another way of like taking your thoughts captive, but you can view your trials and anything that y'all are going through as an opportunity for spiritual growth.
Mm-hmm.
So if you sit there and say, okay, I'm going through this. It's just like the worst. I mean, and we're all guilty of doing it. This is the worst. I'm just like in the pits, and like the devil's going to use that, right? To say, yeah, he is not good. This God that you serve, he's not good. He's not taking care of you. And a lot of us, I feel like, have fallen victim to that, where we're like, woe is me, and it's terrible. But what if you shift your mind again to say, this trial is going to give me an opportunity for spiritual growth, and it's going to give me an opportunity to draw closer to God in ways that I've never experienced before. If you shift your mind to say, how, God, can you draw me closer to you during this? And you shift that narrative of God's not good, and not necessarily that we say that out loud,
Right.
but God, I mean, this is the worst situation, and it might be, that you've ever experienced. But how are you going to use that and change that narrative to say, I'm drawing closer to God?
And think about clay. I mean, there's so many examples of clay in the Bible, but if you've got really hard, unmoldable clay, God can't do as much with you in your story. But if you've got this really good brand new Play-Doh that you just pulled out of the box, like God's able to use that. And so in that narrative, to be flexible, like Katie's saying, and to be moldable and teachable, where God has so much room to move with you in your heart. Because, the big scheme of things is we are all, you think about these Bibles sitting right here, how many stories are in here? Your story, my story, Katie's story is a part of a grander story to God. And so the more that we are moldable and movable, the greater that God's able to do. And he's going to bless that. You think about a rose bush. Let's think about this, just my
Your gardening. Here
my
we go.
gardening, but my visual,
daily gardening.
But rose bushes are so spiky, and they have like
Yes.
these thorns that
Have
can be
them at
nasty.
house.
Yeah, but they're so pretty.
Yeah, they're
So how do you see a rose bush? It's all about perspective. Like, do you focus on the thorns in the
know, I do
narrative, or do
sometimes.
you right?
I do, yeah.
I know.
But that's actually.
But
I mean, I
after you
do
get
in
poked by
real-
one,
I actually did the other day. You're really teaching me something. Go for it.
I know. So it's all about perspective and narrative in your
Yeah.
head. You have these stinking rose bushes, but actually there's more to be grateful for because they're beautiful. There's many different colors. The smells are incredible. They're great. Or you can focus on that one thing that's the thorn in it, or focus on what God's made out of it.
Love that.
And so perspective is a powerful thing. There's one pastor that says perspective can be your power or your prison or your poison, whatever you want to use it as. And it literally, your narrative, what you speak to yourself, what you speak to this world, what you speak out loud is poison, or it's power to the kingdom and to yourself. Because there's power. Death or life is in the tongue. And so whatever you're speaking, like Katie said, a lot of times it's inner thoughts like, God, how can you be good? God, how can you let this happen? But when you change that perspective and that narrative, it literally changes the whole trajectory of your story.
I have here changing the narrative to reflect God's work in your life and how powerful If you shift your perspective on, okay, I'm walking through the darkest season of my life. Let me shift. And you might not be ready for this. And I get that.
Yeah.
But eventually shifting your perspective to say, how can I help somebody else through my witness and what I've been through? And how powerful, saying, I'm going to have an opportunity here. Because I've spoken to several women in the past, and they're so desperate in their season, right? And I just look at them and I see the potential in their story.
Yeah.
That's all I see, because I have a different narrative that they're walking through right now. They haven't shifted their focus yet, but I'm like, man, God's going to use this girl. She is going to be powerful. And so I see it. And I'm sometimes choose not to share that with them then, but sometimes I do. If they're in a place where they can receive it, I'm like, man, God has a powerful story for you. He has a powerful testimony, and God's going to use you and speaking truth into that. And once you change your perspective on what you're walking through in the narrative and say, yes, this is terrible what I'm walking through, but whatever happens, I'm going to choose to sing and give you glory and share my testimony to help others.
You know, it's so crazy sitting here. It like makes me teary eyed, but like that is how God sits back and sees us, because God sees what we can't see, and we see what the men that we're mentoring can't see. And I think about how many women that I've worked with, and like Katie said, sometimes you can see it in that moment. And you're like, whoa, God, like you are about to blow some socks off with this story and with this testimony. And you don't always say it in the moment, but I think about how many women. I had a random one-time phone call a few months ago, and I mean, I cried on the phone with her, and I think her husband had come through S2L, and I was like, you have no idea the power that God's about to give you in your story. You have no idea. But I can see that because I hear your heart in it. I hear how you're open to change the narrative, to let God still be good in this, to choose goodness in this. And so it's so cool, because no matter what you're walking through right now, God sees, but so do other people. And it depends on your narrative as to how God's going to use this, and he wants to use it. Like you think about Abraham and Katie and I mean, it's a very familiar story to us, just not being able to have kids for a while, but Abraham had no idea ever. All he knew that is he couldn't have kids, but that he would one day be the father of nations, many nations. And like, he couldn't see that. And whatever you're walking in right now, like you can't see that, but God can. And so trusting his narrative is hard.
Yeah.
And like Katie said, in the midst of it, it's hard. And it's yet again a choice to say, God, I trust your narrative. I'm going to change my perspective, my thoughts, my way of thinking to whatever you have in front of me today. Whatever.
Yeah. What are some tools that we can do to change the perspective while we're walking through something?
I know one of my biggest ones, and we talk about it a lot, but is being in the Word. And I actually we have friends that we walk through life with as a couple, and they messaged this week about what are some like coping mechanisms or some things that you do that are healthy now. And that was one I was like, I know this may sound cliche to a lot of people, but the Bible, because it teaches me all the time when I'm struggling or when I'm negative, when my narrative is not healthy, to go back and be like, these are the stories of redemption in the Bible. This is what God says about me. This is what God says about him. This is what God says he's going to do. And so anytime I go back to the Word and this living Word, which always speaks something new. Yeah. He teaches and he changes my heart. He changes my head. And I'm telling you, that's the first thing, walking in that field, talking to Jesus, he changes me.
Yeah.
And so those are probably my two biggest that I know some people will be like, oh, she's, the Bible thumper. But it's like, it is the living Word. Try it. I encourage you to try it. See what happens. Like, I encourage that.
Yeah.
What helps with you? Because we all get negative places.
I know. I think that outside of what you said, because obviously I feel like everybody as a believer, your number one needs to be the Bible, because it's literally like a handwritten note to you from the Lord. But just some other ones that have helped me in the past. ways that you can change your perspective or change the narrative in your story is seeking outside counsel, whether it be through a Christian counselor or just a group of friends that can speak truth into you, Christian friends specifically. And so I think for me, having somebody be hard on me and tell me what I need to hear, not what I want to hear, has often changed my perspective.
Yeah.
Like, let's say I have a certain friend, she's kind of blunt with me sometimes. And if I have a negative attitude about something, right? If I have a negative attitude about something, she'll be like, well, have you prayed about that? You know, and I've said that before, or have you done this, or have you done this? And she kind of calls me out on areas that I have been a little weaker on, you know? And so I think people in your life, Christian counselors, and just prayer. Yeah. So I think that is something.
Yeah, I think that's a big one. And you've done it for me numerous times when you're like, hey, how about you change your perspective to this?
Yeah.
Katie didn't say, hey, change your perspective, but she said, what about this? Or, and John and I both have found y'all to like mentorship and somebody that you can call that's going to tell you what you don't necessarily want to hear, but what you need to hear.
Yeah.
That will literally change because it's so easy. We have a couple that we work with and constantly just, hey, well, what about this? Hey, we'll look at it this way. And it's crazy because, I mean, you've done that for me and I'm like, whoa, like, you know, my brain just, and it's just, it's so important to have those people.
Yeah, I agree.
Some of like the more tangible stuff that I had written down is go laugh in the places you've cried. I still have yet to do that where John overdosed. That was a tough one for me to change a narrative in that place. And that was hard. Paint the room and redecorate. I tell a lot of my girls this. Change the house. Like go back where you have that negative story. Change it all right there. Reinvent it, remake it. Work on taking every thought captive. And that's if you're in a really negative place, which I have been a lot in this season that we walk through, it's literally walking through the days and being intentional to recognize every thought that came to my head so that I knew and could just take it captive and get out of that. I mean, it's a hole, you know, and to get out of that hole. And the last thing I had is, you know, I think about the woman at the well sitting there and you think about how much pain and regret and all the feelings she must have had. And Jesus came and he literally changed her narrative in minutes. Yeah. Minutes.
Yes. Yep.
And it's like, are you willing to do that? Are you willing to meet him face to face and let him change your narrative in minutes? Because he can. He can. And so that's ask yourself, like, what is the narrative over my life right now? The true I mean, it's a hard question to ask because you really have to dig into the honesty of yourself and your heart and your head and ask him that. And if it's not good, ask him to change it.
Love that. It's so good.
So
I love that.
That's what I got.
Yeah. So essentially, changing your perspective, the best way to do that is through some of the areas that we've said, but also just how does it align with God's truths and promises in your life? That's how you like shift that perspective to align with who God is, who he says he is. And we've given you some practical ways to do it through our testimony and what's helped us in the past. And so we hope that you found encouragement today with whatever you're going through, that you will shift your perspective, change the narrative, because it can really change the outcome of your story. It really can. And so we hope that you found encouragement in that today. And we hope and pray that you will share this podcast with others that might need it. And if you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you give us a like and a subscribe. You can also email us at hopeafteraddiction@gmail.com. If you have any questions about anything, we'd love to answer those for you. Even here on the podcast, we might do that without sharing your name. So if you find us on the socials, make sure, again, you're sharing that, and you can also private message us there. We hope that you have a great day. We will see you next week, and be blessed.